All right, let's go ahead and continue. All right, so the North versus the South. We're going to go ahead and look at the strengths and weaknesses of the North. The North began the war with impressive strengths. Its population was about 22 million people compared to the South's 9 million. And additionally, the North had about 90% of the nation's manufacturing and most of its bank. So like all those factories, like we see in this picture, 90% of the country's manufacturing and factories were located in the North, as well as its banks. So that means that the North was both richer and more technologically advanced than the South. So already looking like, whoa, like they already have huge advantages, right? They have all these factories that can make all these war supplies, and they have all these banks that can use loans and money to fund the war, because war is very expensive. All right, the North also had geographic advantages too, so about the land. Surprisingly, the North had more farms than the South to provide food for troops. And its land also contained most of the natural resources, right? Most of the country's iron, coal, copper, and gold. So this is like very surprising about those farms, but you guys remember that most of the South's farms were for growing cotton, and you can't eat cotton. While in those border states, and in some northern states too, that's where you have like where all the wheat is grown, corn, other fruits, vegetables. So there's more food farms in the North than in the South at this point, because the South was just all about cotton. All right, let's keep going about the North's advantages. So a lot of strengths here. The North also controlled like the seas, so like the oceans, or the Atlantic Ocean, as well as like the some of the, like the major rivers, and it had 21,000 miles of railroad track, which allowed troops and supplies to be transported wherever they were needed and quickly. So these are huge strengths, right? These are huge strengths. All right, the North's greatest weakness, though, was its military leadership. At the start of the war, about 1/3, 33%, of the nation's military officers resigned and returned to their homes in the South to fight for the South, right? And here's a picture of Abraham Lincoln with a few of the top generals in the United States before the Civil War starts out. And there's a lot of big names here that fought for the South. Right here we got Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart Early, as well as we got some Union generals like George McClellan over here. All right, let's keep going. So during much of the war, Lincoln searched for effective generals who could lead the Union to victory. So the biggest weakness for the North is definitely its military leadership, right? It had a lot of numbers and a lot of soldiers, but the generals were just not as bright and as good as the ones in the South. All the good ones went to fight for the South because that's where they were from. Other weaknesses also is that the North is going to be fighting in the South, so they're kind of unfamiliar to that territory. And they're fighting what's known as an offensive war, which means the Union has to go and invade the South and conquer it, which is a lot harder to do than just to fight a defensive war, which is you just have to not lose and just tire out the other enemy until they give up, right? Just defend your position. So those are some of the weaknesses the North had, but you can see a lot more strengths than weaknesses. Okay, let's go to the South. In contrast to the North, the South's greatest strength was its military leadership. Most of America's best military officers were Southerners who chose to fight for the Confederacy, which was not an easy decision for many of them. So Colonel Robert E. Lee, for example, was not a supporter of either slavery or secession, which means leaving the United States. But he decided that he could not fight against his native Virginia. Robert E. Lee said to Abraham Lincoln when he resigned was, "I cannot bring my sword to Virginia," meaning like against it, like fighting against the state of Virginia. So it goes to show a lot of people, even by 1860, yes, they believed themselves as Americans, but people still really identified with the state they came from, right? And Robert E. Lee is like, hey, I'm from Virginia. My whole family is from Virginia. I'm a Virginian, and I can't fight against Virginia. So Lee resigned from the U.S. Army, and he's going to become commander-in-chief of the Confederate forces. He's going to be the top general for the entire Confederate Army in the South. We're going to see his name a lot in this next 2 weeks. All right, the South had geographic advantages as well. To win the war, the North would have to invade and conquer the South. But the sheer size of the South made this a very daunting task, which means like intimidating and not easy, right? The South is huge. It's way more spread out than the North is. So it's a lot harder to take over. So the South, in contrast, could just win simply by defending its territories until Northerners became tired of fighting. So this is that defensive war. All right, the South did have important geographic disadvantage, though. If the Union did gain control of the Mississippi River, it could divide the Confederacy into two parts. So that's kind of a disadvantage. That's a weakness. Is even though it's a big geography, they could be split in half by if the Union took over the Mississippi River. So we will find out next week if that ever happened. Okay, and then the South's main weaknesses was its economy. Poor, no money. They had to create their own Confederacy dollar because guess what? They're not part of America, so they're not using American dollars. And their economy is going to be terrible. It's only based off farming, really. And it's going to have very weak transportation systems. They don't have a lot of railroads like the North does, right? They really relied on using the rivers. Okay, so the region's agriculturally based economy could not support a long war. They didn't have factories like the North did to produce guns and other military supplies. And the Confederacy also faced serious transportation problems because the South lacked the railroads needed to move troops and supplies quickly over long distances, right? So the South is going to have to rely on like foot soldiers, and they're going to have to march all the whole time and with their supplies. So that's going to wear them down. They can't just hop on a train. All right, let's continue. All right, so let's go ahead and quickly review. So again, the North strengths, higher population, right? 22 million versus 9 million. That's more than double. They also have more access to train lines where they could move troops and supplies quickly. They had more farms to supply food for their men. They were more technologically advanced, right? They controlled all the factories and banks, which means they could make weapons as well as more money. They controlled the Atlantic Ocean with the Navy, and then they had more access to resources like iron, coal, gold, and copper, right? Those are a lot of strengths, right? 7 of them. All right, weaknesses. The big one is that they lack strong military leaders, but also they're fighting in kind of unfamiliar territory, and they're fighting kind of like in this huge landscape, which is really hard to conquer, and they're fighting an offensive war, which is not easy, where they must invade and conquer. Just like the British, when the British were fighting the Americans in the American Revolution, right? It's the same thing. They didn't know the land as well, and they were fighting an offensive war where they had to invade and conquer, whereas America just had to like defend their position and just last longer than their enemy, right? Until the enemy grew tired and just gave up. All right, the South had strong military, leadership, strong military leadership. Let me go ahead and add that in there. As well as they had like home field advantage, right? They know the land. The territories also of the South is very large, so it's harder to invade and conquer. And the other strengths that they had was the Southern cause for these people fighting for the South. They believed, just like in the American Revolution, that they were fighting for and defending their liberties, right? Their states' rights, the right to own slaves. They're also fighting for their homelands and their traditions, right? So this is like the defensive war. All right, weaknesses. They had very few factories to make war supplies, right? Most of the factories are in Richmond. It could be easily split in two. If the North took control over the Mississippi River, they have less people population-wise, which means they have fewer people to fight. And another big weakness is they have less access to train lines for moving troops and supplies. So they're going to have to move troops and supplies either by foot or by like horse wagons. So a lot slower and more tiring. All right, so now let's go ahead and talk about the two leaders at this time. So you're going to have Abraham Lincoln, who is president of the United States. And then you're going to have Jefferson Davis, who is president of the Confederate States of America. So Abraham Lincoln is the leader of the North, which is the United States, the Union. And Jefferson Davis is going to be the leader of this new country, the Confederate States of America, which are the southern states. All right, Abraham Lincoln, he was the North's greatest advantage because he was just a brilliant mastermind of a politician, but also on the battlefield. So he was a huge advantage for the North. And he wanted to preserve the Union for the American people, which means he wanted to keep the United States where it was at. He did not want to lose any states. And he related the preservation of the United States to all these ideals that we learned about of the American Revolution, right? Of freedom, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And one thing is that, like, throughout the war, when it wasn't looking good for the North, he never gave up hope. So a very strong leader. All right, Jefferson Davis, he was a strong believer in states' rights and favored states over the federal government of the United States. And he was a senator that left the Senate when his home state of Mississippi leaves the United States and joins the Confederate States of America. And he believed that they were fighting for freedom that was cherished by the Founding Fathers. So we can see both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis are going to relate to the American Revolution. All right, that's it for Cycle 1 reading. Y'all are going to go ahead and hop into the Google Doc, and you're going to complete questions 1 and 2. You're going to be adding, you add anywhere between 2 to 3 strengths and weaknesses for the North and South. So it's going to be this worksheet right here. You could just do 2 strengths for each. And then I want you to answer this question. Based on the information that you gave here, I want you to predict which side do you think was more likely to win the Civil War. So based on the strengths and weaknesses that you put, and you could put more than 2, tell me which side do you think is going to win this war? The Union, which is the United States, which is the North, or the Confederate, which is the South. Alrighty, y'all are going to have 10 minutes, and I will see y'all back here next week. Have a great day.